Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this professional learning opportunity, How MTSS Fulfills the Mission of Catholic Schools. I am Bailey Cornelius, the Digital Project Coordinator at NCEA, and I will be facilitating this webinar today. A few housekeeping notes as people are joining. We will be recording this session. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A window. We'll monitor any questions and try to answer them in the allotted time. At the end of the session, I will share a link to the online survey in the chat and instructions on how to receive the certificate of completion for the webinar. Today's presenter is Dr. Robert R. Zywicki. He is a
Hello.
seasoned education leader with 2 decades of experience in New Jersey's public school system. He has served as superintendent of schools in both urban and suburban districts, achieving notable successes such as raising graduation rates above 95%, implementing MTSS for at-risk learners, and expanding access to advanced placement programs. Recognized for his leadership, he was named a district thought leader by Future Ready Schools and received the Superintendent to Watch Award from the National School Public Relations Association. Dr. Zywicki has been involved in various statewide initiatives, including committees for curriculum development and COVID-19 school reopening plans. He is also actively engaged in professional development and teaching at several universities. Dr. Zywicki holds a Doctor of Education and MA degrees in Educational Leadership, a BA in History and English, and is pursuing an MBA in Finance and Marketing. He is dedicated to his community, volunteering as a youth coach, and previously serving on the local board of education. Before I turn it over to Dr. Zywicki, let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Father, thank you for all those men and women who have given their talents to educating our young people. Through the challenges they encounter each day, lead them to an ever deeper appreciation of the sacred duty to which you have called them. May they be people of integrity so that they can be witnesses as well as teachers. We pray that the students they lead will become places where our young people can experience your love in their lives. Thank you for our Catholic schools. Help us to pray without ceasing, to work without wavering, and to give without grudging in order to ensure the future of Catholic education for all of our children. We make this prayer through your Son, Jesus Christ, our teacher and Lord. Amen. And now I will hand it over to Dr. Zywicki.
Thank you so much. Truly an honor to be with you today. And as I'll talk about in a couple minutes, this webinar has immense personal and professional weight to it. But before we begin, here on the title screen, you'll see a QR code that if you want to scan that, it'll put me in your contacts. And so after the webinar, or if you share this with friends, I love to nerd out on MTSS and help educational leaders sort through problems when they're trying to figure out how to best meet the needs of a student, or if you have a programming question. So you can contact me at any time. So that QR code will take you to my social media links, as well as give you my cell phone or my email so you can follow up with me. So as it was said in that very nice introduction, MTSS has been the driving factor of my career as an educator and educational leader. And in so many ways, I see it as the fulfillment of not only myself as an educator and my professional aspect of my life, but also my faith life. For me, MTSS is how we can answer the question of, whatever you do for the least of my people, that you do unto me, and that challenge to all of us. And so while I'm working for Renaissance and in that position today, I'm also here as a product of Catholic education and a father who sends his kids to Catholic school. So one of the things that transpired when I retired from 2 decades in education, there was only one place that I felt I could fit in to evangelize about MTSS, and that was with Renaissance Learning. Renaissance was a partner for me in all of those things that you just heard about. And the thing that I love about Renaissance is that it's a truly mission-driven organization, not unlike the ones that you serve. And so every meeting we begin with at Renaissance, we begin with our mission to accelerate learning for all children and adults of all ability levels and ethnic and social backgrounds worldwide. And I had this great position at Renaissance when people say, well, what does that mean? I get to talk about multi-tiered systems of support as a delivery mechanism to make sure that we meet the needs of every single learner. So together with your mission as Catholic educators, our mission together as Catholics, and my mission as an educator working for Renaissance. Let's collaborate together to see every student and help them on their own personal learning journey. And every kid, I know this as a parent, and you know this as educators and parents and aunts and uncles, every student has their own unique learning journey. If I learned nothing else from the Gospels and Catechism, each of the apostles had their own learning journey, had their own faith journey. I always think about Thomas. He was kind of a late bloomer in his faith and in his believing, but everyone has a unique learning journey, and mine began in the Catholic schools. This is a picture of me in 1987 at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Elementary School in Bayonne, New Jersey, where I attended from kindergarten through 8th grade. My father was a member of the permanent diaconate, and he was the deacon in our church. And I served many, many a mass starting at 6 a.m. Every single day. I then went on to attend St. Peter's Prep in Jersey City, New Jersey. There I am graduating with the late Father Keenan, where my mission and vision in life was really shaped about how to be a man for others. And so my choice of education as a profession was completely influenced by my Catholic education. And probably the educator who transformed me the most, who's actually a priest now, is Tom Murphy, who was my 7th grade teacher. So I wouldn't be in education if it wasn't for my Catholic school upbringing. And then later on during my leadership journey, when I returned to earn my graduate degrees and my doctorate, I did so at St. Peter's University because I wanted that faith-grounded education, and I felt it was just so important to have that worldview, because serving in education was a combination of not only dedication to a profession, but living out my faith. And here we are. This is the first day of school, and these are my own 4 kids from left to right. That is Theodore, Olivia, Robert, and Julia. And not only am I putting them up here to kind of give my street cred that I'm a Catholic school parent, but more importantly, I'm a parent of 4 MTSS cases. So Ted, who's all the way there on the left, the little guy, as you can see by his sign, he's a little witty. He can be the lightning rod for some of the most rambunctious behavior of the eldest 4. But Ted learned to read during the pandemic. He was in kindergarten when the pandemic happened. And the schools that he was in at the time were fully remote. So Ted is a member of the class of 2032. And the class of 2032 are those pandemic babies who are finishing up 4th grade right now and heading into 5th grade. And depending on what data you look at, kind of the best estimate for many of those kids who are not in Catholic schools is they're at about 40% reading proficiency. Ted has an IEP for speech, which came from, even though he had 2 parents at home, was learning to read through a Chromebook. And so there's a whole cohort of kids for which learning loss is not over, who in many ways are our most at-risk group of students. And so Ted is continuously receiving services for his speech IEP as well as for Tier 2 supports. Olivia is a different type of MTSS kid. Olivia she's a very, very high achiever, taking all kinds of AP classes and honors classes as a freshman. She had a different set of issues in which, without universal screening to identify that she needed enrichment, she was starting to develop social, emotional, and behavioral issues related to not being stimulated. And so one of the biggest misnomers about MTSS is that it's all about being at risk. And actually, nothing could be further from the truth. The universal screening we do for MTSS also shows us which kids need enrichment. And then my eldest boy, Robert, who's in 6th grade right now, he was, universally screened in kindergarten and 1st grade and was doing just fine. And then his teachers came to us and said, hey, there's something going on here. When we look at the trend line, we keep reassessing him and he keeps falling below and below and below. You might want to get his eyes checked. Next thing you know, we found ourselves in the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where we found out that Robert has Stargardt's disease. Stargardt's disease is juvenile macular degeneration, essentially central vision loss. So in the center of his visual field, He has this kind of black Swiss cheese where it makes it very difficult for him to recognize faces, to read small text, to look at a scoreboard. He can't do that. So Robert reads and writes in Braille and uses lots of assistive technology in which he needs most things enlarged to 40 font print, and does a lot with audiobooks because it's hard to read paperback books. But he's thriving and succeeding well in school. And so Robert's a perfect example of an MTSS student going from tier 2 to tier 3 and thriving in Catholic schools. And Julia, my youngest daughter, is for me emblematic of so many kids who in first grade struggle to graduate from early readers to chapter books. They struggle with decodability, they struggle with fluency. And we had a difficult time getting Julia to get on grade level. But the reason why I wound up running for my local board of education at the time was because of this feeling that if I'm struggling with my own child to get these services, what about other parents who don't know the ins and outs of educational research and have all those resources? So, for me, MTSS is very near and dear to my heart for all the good things it's done for kids in my career, but it's also very important for my own kids, all of whom currently attend the Catholic Academy of Sussex County in New Jersey, which is Reverend Brown School, Pope John Middle School, and Pope John High School. And so when it comes to the concept of being inclusive and, can Catholic schools meet the needs of kids beyond tier 1 and tier 2? I absolutely love this quote from Pope Francis from 2016. Our communities are still struggling to practice a true inclusion, full participation that finally becomes ordinary, normal. And this requires not only technical and specific programs, but first of all, recognition and acceptance of faces, tenacious and patience confidence that each person is unique and unrepeatable. And the thing that I really hone in on here is, the mission part of acceptance and inclusion, but also the technical aspect. Multi-tiered systems of support and serving kids at tier 2 and tier 3 is very difficult work. And that very difficult work requires a couple of elements. And this is from what's been in several NCEA publications. And so beyond the mission of Catholic schools, which I will talk about in a second, and the messaging around MTSS, because Catholic schools and MTSS are a perfect match for each other when it comes to values and being faith-based in how we educate. And I don't ever have a debate on that with Catholic educators. They get that. The part where it becomes difficult are some of these leadership factors on some of the ins and outs of running an MTSS program and being able to lead confidently. This is new work. And with so many kids coming into our Catholic schools with so many different needs, unlike what we had before the pandemic, it can be very daunting for the leader. And then we always have resource issues with Catholic schools. We don't have a lot of the resources as local public schools. But there are resource issues inherent to MTSS. And so in the webinar today, I'm going to address with you the mission and messaging factors of how MTSS connects to who we are in Catholic education, and then give you some tips and some topics within those leadership and resource factors to help you implement MTSS in your individual setting. And so when it comes to the mission and messaging factors, there's one term for me that sums up how MTSS connects to Catholic education, and that's cura personalis, from the Latin for care for the whole person. And when we're talking about students, we talk about the whole child. And so this has long been used by many Catholic educators over decades and centuries to talk about what sets apart Catholic education, about how Catholic education appeals not only to the intellect, cares for the body, cares for the soul, cares for the mind. And so MTSS is cura personalis, personified and embodied. And so, when it comes to are our Catholic schools living this out, I absolutely love this statistic from NCEA. Yes, the answer is yes. Our Catholic schools are, in fact, they have implemented MTSS, and they're serving not only tier 2 students, but also tier 3 students who have IEPs. And so, almost 8% of all of the students currently in Catholic schools are receiving some tier 3 services. And I think that's a ringing endorsement of how MTSS is aligned via Cura Personalis to the mission of and messaging of Catholic schools. And like I said earlier, how we message and show the world, not just by words but by deeds. Here's Robert. He's not just thriving in Catholic school academically, but fully participating in athletics. Here he is on the wrestling team, doing really, really well, representing a school which he has a lot of pride in. And so these are shining examples of how Pope Francis's words about being accepting, about being inclusive, are the modern face of Catholic schools. And it's the technical aspect which could be so daunting. And that's the part we're really going to focus on today. But when it comes to explaining and messaging for parents and even for students, what is MTSS? I think one of the easiest things, if you can make the reference, it's Cura Personalis in action. And the way that we do that is through a five-step process of screening, strengthening instruction, identifying either needs for intervention or for enrichment or both, monitoring the efficacy of that instruction, and then evaluating yet again. And so the pedagogy behind this, the two places where we can really look for where this has come into the field of education, first and foremost is Benjamin Bloom. I was just in Chicago last week at an MTSS lab for big public school districts, and we were talking about the legacy of Benjamin Bloom. Most people know Benjamin Bloom for Bloom's taxonomy. And that was a major, major contribution to education for public education and Catholic school alike. But one of the things that sometimes gets lost in the kind of pedagogical sauce is Bloom's mastery learning. And so all of the research that Bloom did in Chicago on mastery learning really was the foundation for modern day response to intervention, and then what we now call what has morphed into multi-tiered systems of support. The other person that really influenced the spread and adaption of MTSS is John Hattie. John Hattie, famous researcher. I like to joke right now. John Hattie is kind of the avocado toast of educational research. He's everywhere. He's on every menu. You can't have a conversation about educational research without talking about John Hattie. But what John Hattie did in his meta-analysis, his global meta-analysis, he concluded not once but twice that the biggest, the most effective initiative for a system, an individual school, an individual grade level, an individual school, or a diocese of schools, or a public school system is response intervention, multi-tiered systems of support. And then inherent to that, the next most important factors were teacher use of data to talk about student growth, and then student metacognition of their own performance data to develop goals. So there's a deep research base on MTSS, and it aligns perfectly with our Catholic values. The technical aspect can be very overwhelming, and so we're going to go a little bit further into that now. So the data for MTSS is not just the academic data that we're used to. While the academic data is very, very important, the non-academic factors are equally important. Student social emotional development, their engagement in school for a variety of reasons, behavior, and we're going to talk a lot more about that later on, their attendance patterns, tardiness, their various learning competency profiles, how they learn best, what type of activities they like. Data like the frequency of how often they go to the health office, observations of their relationships and how they are mapped with others. What language do they speak at home? And we have more and more emerging data every day that being bilingual, which so many of our Catholic students are, is actually a superpower. And not something to be thought of as a deficit. That actually being able to juggle two languages, we used to do it with Latin and Greek in Catholic education. Now, so many ways, it's Spanish is the prevalent language in American Catholic schools. Is actually something that gives kids all kinds of powers that helps them in all kinds of other areas. And just like the public schools, the Catholic schools now are also, for better or worse, mental health practitioners. So you can't just focus on the academic. And if we're going to talk about the whole child, it's this balance between academic and non-academic data. So when it comes to the technical and specific elements of MTSS, it began as response to intervention, which is often represented as a triangle or a pyramid that's cut into 3 tiers. Tier 1 being the instruction that all students receive. And so one of the things that I think so often gets where there's a lot of confusion is around that Tier 1 is where differentiation takes place. For many teachers coming out of teacher prep programs about 20 years ago, there was this idea that Tier 1 was not differentiated, and nothing could be further from the truth. Differentiation has to happen in Tier 1. Where teachers struggle with Tier 1, and I'll talk more about this later on, is that they used to be, they used to have classrooms where 80 to 90% of the students were on grade level. So often now, because of the diversity of students who are coming into Catholic schools, coming into public schools because of the pandemic, those numbers are very skewed to a place where in some classroom settings, only 40–50% of the students are on grade level. And the teachers don't have the training to differentiate for that diversity of learner. And also their classroom materials, their textbooks, their worksheets, all their resources are not designed necessarily for students who have that variety of learning needs. Tier 2 is that extra support that some students receive, and that's usually in a group setting. Going back to Benjamin Bloom, he called Tier 2 lab time. It was time before and after the core lesson for students to get extra support. And in these small groups, and so there is a boundary that has, kind of blurred sometimes between Tier 1 and Tier 2. But in these small groups, students are working on common skills where they need extra intensification of instruction, and that instruction is monitored to make sure that students do get on grade level. And if they do get on grade level, then they can return and just receive Tier 1. The other thing that people often get confused about is that Tier 2 does not replace Tier 1. It's always in addition to, and that's really important also later on when we talk about funding possibilities, right? So kids get Tier 1 and then they get some Tier 2. Oftentimes teachers are providing Tier 2 before and after school during lunch, and they don't even think of it as Tier 2. But some kids get Tier 2, and that is always going to be in that group setting. When you look at the large body of research on MTSS, I would like to say operationally, Tier 2 usually happens around 2 times a week in frequency. It could happen more, but it's around 2 times a week. Tier 3 is the most intensive form of support. So not every kid who gets Tier 3 supports has an IEP or a 504. It's really about how intensive the support is and the frequency. So generally speaking, Tier 3 supports happen 3 or more times a week. And so it could be for a student who does not have an IEP or a 504, but just requires that much extra support, tutoring, whatever it may be, to get them back to Tier 2 and then hopefully back to Tier 1. Just like Tier 2 being in addition to Tier 1, Tier 3 is always in addition to and does not replace Tier 2. Now, if a student does have an IEP or a 504, those are generally considered to be Tier 3 supports. So this paradigm is not new. It's been around for a really long time and was really, it spread through the upper Midwest, then to the West Coast. And where it really gained a tremendous amount of support was in the reauthorization of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 2004. As a early warning system and also a mechanism to collect data and provide interventions for students on their way if they are going to get an IEP. And so while there's that national federal authorization to use response intervention MTSS, every state has its own flavor of this. Where RTI, which is really academic response intervention, morphed into MTSS is that it's not just academic response intervention, but also behavioral response to intervention as well, that combination of the academic and the behavioral sides of the coin for the whole child. Each state has its own format. So depending on your individual school or your diocese and how they're aligned to the state, there are some really common elements, which I will address in a second, but the frameworks can all be a little bit different. So for example, in California, it's academic and it's behavioral, but there's also other factors such as social emotional learning. And in New York, they even have cultural competencies. In Florida, it's just academic and behavioral. So depending on your state, there may be different specific models you would like to look at. But generally speaking, at a basic level, the four things that are in most MTSS paradigms are academic response to intervention, behavioral response to intervention, enrichment, which many people never really thought of as being part of MTSS, but it is. So your school-wide enrichment model or your gifted and talented program, and then anything you do around character education, social emotional learning, collaboration, that also fits under MTSS as well. So regardless of whether you use a state framework or whether you use your own framework, going back to the research of Benjamin Bloom and John Hattie, there's these five main elements for MTSS: screening students, strengthening instruction, identifying the interventions, monitoring progress, and then evaluating effectiveness. So when we screen all students, there is an inherent equity to this because every single kid is then eligible for intervention. Every kid is also eligible for enrichment. So that one singular data set of growth, proficiency, independent reading level, things like that, will tell us exactly where kids are at. I like to use the analogy that universal screening is like the APGAR score, and that we bring all of our babies into the world with a universal screening mechanism. Baby, it emerges from the womb, and immediately the nurses take a look, and based on a variety of factors, if they yell out a number that's 7 or higher, that baby's doing just fine. Let's cut the umbilical cord and take some pictures. If it's 7 to 5, hold on one second, and there's going to be some suctioning. The nurses are going to take vitals, excuse me. And then after that's resolved, they'll go back to cutting the umbilical cord and taking pictures. If the nurses yell out a number that's below 5, but above 3, that's when the doctor will actually leave the mother and come over and attend to the child. And if it's below 3, they call the NICU. And some of my own kids and many other kids have survived that process of coming into the world because of the APGAR score. So we universally screen our babies to identify what risk factors are, and we have research-based interventions ready to go. Where sometimes there's a disconnect is, are we doing that when we hand off our babies in kindergarten to our schools? How are we attaining to that? So one of the ways to explain universal screening to parents is to say, hey, this is the academic and behavioral APGAR score for your kids. We want to see where they're at. And if there's anything that's not 100% up to snuff, we have research-based strategies to help them. And that changes the discussion when it comes to universal screening data. When you see that a child, is below grade level, instead of having conflict with a parent, it's like, no, we're going to help. This is now going, because we have this data, we can help. On the intervention side, universal screening also tells us which students are above grade level and need to be pushed and need to be enriched. When it comes to strengthened tier 1 instruction, one of the things that's most difficult for teachers when it comes to differentiation, which I'll show you guys in a lot more specificity in a little while, is not having the data to know what the composition of their classroom is. So it can be very, very difficult for teachers to adapt and break up whole group instruction if they don't know exactly where their kids are at. The other thing is that we have placed upon teachers these kind of arbitrary scope and sequences. I remember when I first started teaching, I was told, you got to get to chapter 12 by Thanksgiving. But what about the different learning styles of my kids. I can't get everyone there. And so am I the teacher who's behind because my grade partner got to chapter 13 by Christmas and I didn't? So one of the things that we need to do is make sure teachers have that universal screening data, because each classroom has a different composition. Each classroom is going to have a different group of learners with different needs and a different standards profile. And so in order to make that tier one differentiation, actually a reality, teachers need that data, and they also need to be trained in a very, very caring way on how to differentiate. And that's training that has to happen on a regular basis. When it comes to tier two and tier three, in addition to tier one, sometimes there can be a lot of confusion as to what are interventions. Is it just intensification of instruction? Is it something that has to come from the What Works clearinghouse? And the answer to that, it's a combination of all those factors. I like to define, not divine. We're on a Catholic webinar, we're divining. I'd like to define tier two and tier three interventions at any time you give a student extra support to try and get them on grade level. And that can take you in many, many different directions. That can be good old fashioned pen and paper tutoring. It could be practice note cards, and it could be use of software to get them there as well. So once you have strengthened tier one, and based upon the universal screening data, you identify which students need tier two and tier three. The magic happens in progress monitoring. So we teach, we instruct, we intervene, and it's in the progress monitoring where we see how far away is a student from the trend line that they should be on. Where is their current trend line, and how can we close that gap? And one thing I'll talk about more later on is it's not just good enough to have growth. What we now know in looking at a lot of research coming out of the pandemic, that 20%, 30% growth, while good, isn't enough to change a proficiency level. So we want to make sure we're using strategies and empowering our teachers and giving them tools that really get students to like a 50, even a 60 student growth percentile, because that's when they actually go from needing support to approaching the standard to actually meeting the standard. And that evaluation piece for each individual student or our students in a grade band has implications for individual progress, but also for you as a school leader when it comes to budgeting for the next year, when it comes to how many supports you're going to need possibly over the summer for after school tutoring programs. So the evaluation of how the screening, how the tier one and tier two went, and the progress monitoring is just as important as actually carrying it all out. And so having a system to capture all of this is really a challenge right now for many leaders, and it's one of the things that I work with districts on the most. So when you put this whole together, you have the modern MTSS system, which incorporates those 5 research-based factors that are about 65 years old. So this isn't flash in the pan stuff. We have a lot of research on this, and then the idea of combining accurate assessment with your practice and instruction tools, and then those insights on how to tweak our instruction and our assessment. When you put those all together, that is the modern MTSS system. And at Renaissance, we have lots of solutions to support you in this. And I'm not going to get into any of that now. And yes, we are a company that has all this. But what I will tell you, no matter what tools you use, whatever software you use, whatever system you use, whether you're just using good old-fashioned Google Sheets, the pedagogy will always trump the technology. And so if you don't have an MTSS framework that's aligned to the pedagogy, you can buy all the tools in the world, you can buy all the software, it's not going to make for an effective MTSS system. The pedagogy is what works. It's the framework. The individual tools that you use, yes, you can make it better and you can make it easier for your teachers, but having the framework is so important. And so what we just talked about was one, how to review quickly, and then I'll take some questions if anyone has any, how MTSS explicitly aligns with the mission, how MTSS aligns with the messaging of Catholic schools, and then now we're going to get into how we live out that mission of Catholic education through MTSS. But I'm going to pause here, and if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I saw in the chat someone said, "Are you going to get these slides?" Absolutely. You're going to get a link to these slides at the end of this. But if anyone wants to come off mute and ask me some questions, I'm happy to answer them.
So Dr. Zywicki, they cannot actually come off mute,
Oh, okay.
but we do have a question in the Q&A.
Sure.
Someone
Sure.
asked if there were any examples of an engagement survey.
Sure, I can. I can actually. I will send that out to all the participants. So yeah, there are a couple of those. Renaissance has two, tools that fall under our social emotional or SEB platform, and that is Sabers and Renaissance Fundamentals, which also pertain to student overall engagement in schools. So that could be a tool. There are also lots of other examples where you can kind of tweak them for your own school to see where their engagement is. But generally speaking, any of those engagement surveys are going to focus on a couple areas. One, how are students interacting with their academics? Do they set academic goals? And are they explicit about that? Do they discuss that with their friends and families and their teachers? Do they have, what we call social emotional goals? Do they aspire to have friends, to have deep, meaningful relationships, to have a good relationship with not only their peers, but the adults in their lives? Do they have wellness goals? Are they attending to nutrition and health and exercise? And then last, one of the most important engagement factors is, do they have a level of learning goal? And do they set goals based upon college and career readiness? Do they set goals based upon, I explicitly make sure I take music every year, and I take instrumental music because I love playing the guitar and the trumpet, identifying what their goals are. So the Harvard Ed Redesign Group has a great format of what they call student success plans, and how to use goal setting around those four areas to not only see where kids are at with engagement in the overall educational process, but also to get them more engaged through goal setting. Very good question. Any other questions? Okay, so we're going to keep going, and now we're going to talk about how we live out that mission, right? And so this is one of my favorite quotes that comes from James. You guys are probably very familiar with this. If someone says he has faith but does not have works, can that faith save him? If a brother or sister has nothing to wear and no food for the day, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm, and eat well," but you do not give them the necessities of the body, what good is it? So also faith of itself does not have works is dead. And so MTSS fully aligned with that faith component of the mission of schools and the messaging around Catholic schools. And now we're going to get into the leadership and resource parts of how we live out this mission when it comes to MTSS. And so this is one of my favorite questions that kind of stumps people. Do you know your ABCs? This is an important leadership factor. And when we're talking about ABCs, I'm referring to the about 50 years of research prior to the pandemic on what data we look at to ensure kids graduate from high school on time and have positive post-secondary outcomes. And so when they referred to ABCs, it was attendance, behavior, and course completion. And when they talked about attendance, it really focused on middle school and high school attendance. Kind of tardies, whether excessive absences, and then how did that correlate to at-risk behavior like, drug use, or, just not, being disengaged from school. And then when it came to behavior, it was the research was almost entirely focused on disciplinary infractions, the frequency of those disciplinary infractions and severity. And a lot of the research was really focused on suspensions. And as any high school vice principal or dean of discipline will tell you, that there's a group of kids who get suspended, but then there are other kids where it's kind of the frequent flyers of kids who are getting multiple detentions, but never actually go into the range of suspension. And then they will also tell you there's lots of kids who have behavioral issues where it never manifests itself in discipline issues, but in other behaviors. And we're learning more and more about that, particularly in the post-pandemic era. And when it comes to course completion, there was all this research done in both private schools and public schools about middle school GPA being this major indicator of course completion, and then eventually high school completion and graduating from the school that kids start in ninth grade. The research then shifted to look at standardized test scores as being predictive and looking at promotion. And then it has evolved into, what we now know, looking, Grant Wiggins wrote about this before he passed. Also a researcher, Russell Rumberger at the University of California, about independent reading level, and a student's independent reading level in first grade, third grade, and then having a sufficient enough independent reading level, which is about 1,000 Lexile level, to complete Algebra 1, and that kids who complete Algebra 1 either in eighth grade or by the end of ninth grade are basically, regardless of socioeconomics, on a track to complete high school on time, don't attend summer school sophomore and junior year. Whereas kids who struggle with independent reading, it manifests as a math issue that really crystallizes in Algebra 1. So since the pandemic, we've moved beyond the ABCs, still keeping them, but now looking at some other factors being really important, ABCs plus, if you will. And these include knowing the child's family status, their socioeconomics, also their household structure. Who are they living with? And how does that impact their social emotional progression? How does that impact their academics? Their learner profile. And as I showed you earlier, Catholic schools are serving more and more students with a diverse learner profile. Students who are English language learners, students with IEPs and 504s, students have been in this country for a very long time or who have moved from state to state multiple times. Students who may have started in a public school as a tier 2 or tier 3 student who have now come into Catholic schools and have that continuing tier 2 and tier 3 status. Their federal subgroup, their racial subgroup, and then also something that's really important, their relationship map. Who do they have positive relationships with within the school? Not just kids, but adults, support staff, and especially their principal. When it comes to trauma, there's more and more research on the impact of students who have had, their families have had any interaction with state child protective services, any members of their family who have been incarcerated, migration and interrupted education. More and more we're seeing this, particularly in the South, and as migrants are moving all across the United States, and students who have been victims of physical and sexual abuse. All of this data is just as important as the ABCs in constructing a really good MTSS program. So where we're at now, in different states call it different things when it comes to integrated MTSS, but a modern MTSS system includes behavioral response intervention, academic response intervention, your acceleration and enrichment program, and then your SEL and collaboration curriculum and efforts. And so the data that flows from the ABCs Plus informs you where kids are at. So you can have kids who are getting behavioral response intervention supports, but don't necessarily need academic RTI supports, but actually are getting some acceleration, and who actually need extra support when it comes to their social, emotional, and their collaboration development. And then you have other kids who are struggling when it comes to academic response intervention, and then that leads to behavioral response intervention issues. So all of this, these are all technical mechanisms to address these various data points that attend to the whole child. And so when we're talking about universally screening, almost all of us immediately go to academic universally screening. And for those of you who are well-schooled in RTI, you'll talk about independent reading level and the science of reading in early childhood, and that is all absolutely vital. One of the things we now know is that social emotional development, non-academic factors, are the denominator in an equation in which academic success is the numerator. And so this is me in 1994 on my MOS retreat at St. Peter's Prep with my classmates. And in my school, my Catholic school, this gentleman right here, Anthony Azzardo, Father Tony, we used to call him Taz, he was our non-academic universal screening early warning system. He probably slept 3 hours a night. He knew everything that was going on with every kid. Positive things going on, struggles, breakups, dealing with substance abuse, family issues, parents who lost jobs, deaths in the family. And he had it all in here. And he ministered to all of us. And, Father Azzardo passed about a year ago, and, he's a saint. And so many Catholic institutions have someone like Father Azzardo. The issue is that Father Azzardo had all the time to dedicate to that. We don't have that with so many of our faculty members in the laity who have to go home to their own families and who can't be up at 11 o'clock at night attending to all these issues. We need a system to collect all this data. And then not only that, it would be very helpful for our assistant principals if they had behavioral information as kids are going from middle school into high school or transferring from public school into our Catholic schools. But here's the state of where we are in education today. 87% of all surveyed private and public schools said that the pandemic had had a negative impact on the social and emotional development of our kids. 84% said that it negatively impacted their behavioral development. So first of all, I want to know who said, whereas the other 16 and 13% respectively, because the pandemic was really hard on kids. It was very hard, and kids re-entering school, coming from schools where they were shut down for a year or more, has presented many challenges for our Catholic educators. So at Renaissance, we combine our social, emotional, and the behavior from positive interventions and supports into SEB. We talk about it as SEB, being two factors that come together. And so one of the things when I'm working with vice principals and principals is, wouldn't it be great if you had frequency data on how often students went to their guidance counselor, how often there were disciplinary infractions, any of these other factors in the ABCs plus. Wouldn't it be great if you had that before the school year started? So you can put in behavioral interventions, have lunch with these kids the first week of school, develop relationships before it culminates in a big blow up in October or November. So screening for this has taken on many, many different aspects. There are behavioral response intervention frameworks in almost every single state. And there are really good research-based tools to look at not only the teacher perception of students being at risk for behavioral issues, but also the student own self-perception of and metacognitively where they see themselves struggling. And if that is too much for your organization right now, and as a leader, sometimes you have to read the room and make sure your faculty is ready for it. This has been around for almost 30 years. There are a variety of free frequency-based behavior tools that you can use to tier students based upon the frequency of behavioral instances, trips to the guidance counselor, times that they've needed counseling, not only that, their attendance data, to basically create a risk profile that you can monitor during the school year and have for students as they're transitioning into your school at the point of transfer or at the beginning of the year. For me, the most difficult leadership factor that I struggled with was in MTSS was getting teachers to be comfortable with differentiated instruction at the tier 1 level. It's really, really hard. And as my career progressed, as we talked earlier, there's more and more diversity of learners, more and more kids who need extra supports. But when we look at the research on what is differentiation, it's meeting the needs of students. But there's 4 ways to do this. The first one is differentiating by content, that not everyone's going to be reading To Kill a Mockingbird, right? If I know the independent reading levels of my sophomore English class, and I have some kids in my class who are at the 800, 900 level, and I have some kids who are at a 1300 Lexile level, let's use a diversity of texts to explore the themes that we have in To Kill a Mockingbird. Process is going to be all of your accommodations and modifications and where you intensify instruction. So using your universal screening data to meet the needs of kids, right? This could be providing them notes, it could be providing them extended time, or for like my son, Robert, that everything is magnified or if it's in Braille. Differentiation for product, this is a place where it's actually a very easy way to differentiate, in which you give kids the choice of a couple of options. So if you're learning about, the causes of the Civil War, they can, show that to you in a traditional essay. They can create a website, they can create a skit, they can do a podcast, right? Giving kids opportunities to be creative, which is once again at the height of Bloom's taxonomy, to create also helps with engagement. But the most important factor of differentiation is grouping. And when it comes to grouping, knowing a child's independent reading level and grouping based upon subject is really, really important. So in math, Homogeneous grouping is very, very important. If any of you had a lesson in your childhood of do 1 through 23 odd problems in the back of the chapter tonight for homework, and have suffered through some of those lessons, you know that there were some kids in class who probably could have started at number 21 and gone to 40. And then there were other kids who were just sitting there, saying novenas, hoping they don't get called on because anything past number 7, they were really struggling with. So one of the ways that you can differentiate using homogeneous groups are, my need supports kids. They're going to do 1 through 9 with 11 as a challenge problem. Then I'm going to work with them in a station rotation. My on standards kids, they're going to start at 8 and they're going to start at 9 and they're going to go to 17 and then do 19 and 21 as challenge problems. And then my exceed standard students, they start at 21. I don't have to create a new lesson to do that, but I can meet the needs of the kids. When it comes to ELA, which are all the subjects other than math, heterogeneous groups, we know through the science of zone of proximal development is the best way to start, where you have kids of mixed levels. If you look at the science of Orton Gillingham and how I read brown out loud, and that helps a student decode the word green, there is zone of proximal development in the ELA subjects. As you do interventions, though, in those subjects, they become smaller and smaller groups and more homogeneous. But having this knowledge of what's the composition of my classroom, how many kids in my classroom need support, approach, meets, and exceeds, and then how do I group students is a crucial question for teachers and helps them to unpack the idea that they have this diversity of learners. It also frees them from the idea that every single classroom in 4th grade has to get to chapter 12 by Thanksgiving. It's not going to happen if we're going to serve this diversity of learners. And it gives teachers a framework to use their universal screening data. So if there's no other piece of universal screening data that you go over with your teachers, it's independent reading level. And this is Scarborough's reading rope, which is so famous and has been brought to the forefront because of the new emphasis on the science of reading. But long before that was in vogue, Grant Wiggins used to say that graduation in America is simply who has 1,000 Lexile levels. So our Catholic schools all meet the state graduation requirements for graduation attainment. And in so many ways, what we do in up to 3rd grade is to get kids to a 500-600 Lexile level. And that's usually the reading level that most standardized test questions are written at in 3rd grade. And then by high school, really a 900 to 1,000 Lexile level are what the Algebra 1 questions and assessments are written in, as well as their textbooks. So if kids hit those benchmark independent reading levels, then they're going to be pretty successful. But when I think back on my teaching career and I think about students that I had behavioral conflict with as a young teacher, it was oftentimes when we did textbook activities. And in having a relationship with those kids long after we both left those schools, I had honest conversations with them. Why were you always angry when we would do textbook activities? And they were like, because I couldn't read it. And now I go back and I think, what if I was armed with the independent reading level of those students? How would it have changed my ability to differentiate and avoided behavioral conflict with those students? So arming your teachers with independent reading level and looking at the composition of your classroom based upon independent reading level is a first great step to supporting your teachers in differentiation. Once you do that, one of the most important pieces of differentiation to see if it's working and then to check on the efficacy of not only tier 2, but tier 3 is in progress monitoring. And progress monitoring, I like to say, is if you don't have a trend line, you're not progress monitoring. But our teachers all genuinely care about kids. And so when they see that students are off the trend line, they start immediately brainstorming. What strategies can I use? What can I do? How can I intensify instruction to get them there? Right? So the progress monitoring is where we see the response to the intervention. We see the response to the intensification. And it's also where we get the data to see, hey, only tier 1 and tier 2 is not working. This student needs some doses of tier 3 and maybe an IEP, right? This makes it a scientific decision on whether a student gets an IEP rather than based upon other factors that are not as quantitative. And so when it comes to differentiation, it's so important that the person providing training for the teachers is not someone from the outside who comes by for a single day to do some drive-by differentiation training, who's like, hey, everyone, remember when you were in teacher prep and they told you about differentiation? Well, I'm going to do all that right now with you, and I'll never see you again. It's so important that the principal is the MTSS champion. And if the principal is the MTSS champion, these are some of those behaviors. And the Wallace Foundation did research on this. What are the most effective characteristics of principals in their schools that do MTSS well? First and foremost, the principal leads the data PLCs with the teachers. They don't farm it out or have someone else do it. They budget and staff for MTSS. They schedule for MTSS, which I'll talk about in a minute. They celebrate MTSS success stories. Our schools are very good at celebrating all the kids who take AP exams and get into elite universities, Boston College and Notre Dame and all those other things. But do we celebrate a student who was tier 2 and tier 3 for 2 years and now they've passed Algebra 1 on time, right? Like, that is so hard for so many kids. Do we celebrate those MTSS stories, and what does that look like? And then the ultimate characteristic of principals who are MTSS champions, they are the lead differentiation coaches. And some tips for your principals, or if you are a principal, when you're observing teachers or you're coaching them or providing feedback, instead of using the traditional evaluation where you look at their lesson structure and it's kind of a formal, you're telling them what they did, instead ask them these questions. And this is a framework that can help you develop a better professional rapport with your teachers, but also get them to, like our kids, metacognitively see what decisions they're making. So the first question, what's the composition of your classroom? This will tell you right there, are your teachers connected to the universal screening data? What decisions did you make on grouping your kids homogeneously or heterogeneously? Well, I didn't really group, it was whole group. That's a point for you to coach right there. Then, if you can get past that, saying, hey, of the 4 elements of differentiation, which 2 were here? Which 2 did you think you emphasized? And possibly the most important, the most effective thing in good tier 1 differentiation in an MTSS framework, did this lesson build relationships between the students and the teacher and the students and each other, right? So you might have teachers who for the first 6 months can only get to question 1. And then by the end of the year, you get into question 2. And then beginning of next year, you get into question 3, right? So it's a progression, but you as the principal are the coach. And here are questions that are not gotcha questions to get them there to help you become an MTSS champion. And with all this, and you put it together, the key question for the principal, like I said earlier, are we making enough growth that it changes a proficiency level? So, this pushes us to expand our boundaries beyond, we made 20% growth this year. That's great. Is it enough to make a difference? And we want to make sure we make enough growth to make a difference. And so we've checked off our mission factors, some of our leadership factors, and then the messaging factors, but probably one of the most difficult things, and everyone's like, I was waiting for him to get to this. What are the resource factors? And there are some really important resource factors, the foremost of which is, where do we have time? Where do we have time in our schedule for tier 2 and tier 3? And for those of you who have done high school schedules, it's very, very difficult, very, very time consuming, and very, very emotionally draining. So the prospect of having to look at your schedule again can be something where you might just want to click off this webinar, but stick with me. So at Renaissance, we've identified 9 top challenges when it comes to implementing MTSS. And when you get these slides, you can review them. And our MTSS toolkit and our progress monitoring ebooks will all help you lead your teachers and design an MTSS that deals with all of these. But at the end of a webinar, at the end of a PD day, there's always the conversation and after the conversation. And the conversation after the conversation, the one in the parking lot that I have with so many Catholic school principals is, that's all great. I just don't have time to do this. How can I make time to do MTSS? Well, we have an answer for it, and it's not a new answer. It goes back to Benjamin Bloom. So when Benjamin Bloom was first talking about RTI, which then we now know as MTSS, I told you he called it buffer time at first, right? It was this time during the day because he knew kids wouldn't come before and after school. And even when there was federal funding coming into public schools, the kids were not going to come before and after school. So there was this need for what then he called lab time. So you have your English class, and then there was a reading lab before, and then a reading lab after. The teacher would assign kids to come. Some of them would go to both. Some of them would come to one. There would be math lab, right? And so this concept, kind of, evolved over time to what we call win time, which is what I need now. And so what I need now can be any of those things: buffer time, lab time. It's that extra tutoring and support. It's explicit tier 2 and tier 3 interventions. It's where you can do ESL instruction, which should always be in addition to your tier 1 instruction. Gifted and G&T, gifted and talented, school-wide enrichment. This is where you can do your social emotional. You can do counseling. You can do team project-based learning. This is where you can do coding. You can do robotics. You can do National History Day. You can also do peer leadership during this time, right? So you can attend to all of those different whole child factors through an explicit time set in the day, that is in addition to your core academic time. Now, this has many different names in the research. Oftentimes at middle school, it's called flex time. In most elementary schools, it usually has the school mascot. So you'll see bear time and lion time. And in the research, when it comes to high schools, they call it TAG a lot, teacher assisted guidance. And it's usually tagged to a lunch. So it's before or after. But in these slides, one of the things that I will give you are some sample schedules. But generally speaking, as an elementary principal, one of the things to think about is, what does the research say about how long should your ELA and math blocks be? Does the research support 160-minute ELA blocks, 80-minute math blocks? Take a look at that and then see where you can shave off some time for the day to find a 30 to 40-minute win period. In middle school, one of the easiest ways to find some time, which also helps with student control and discipline, is at lunch. Most middle school students don't need an hour or a 45-minute lunch. Looking at my own kids, they can inhale lunch in about 30 seconds. So there's time to use lunch and then schedule the teacher lunches elsewhere and find time in the middle school. At the high school, what many private, Catholic, and public schools use is a unit lunch system where it's divided between academic and lunch periods, or they use a tag. And then one of the best practices where there's a lot of research is eliminating study hall and turning those into MTSS or RTI periods. So when you look at what win time can do for you, there's really a 5-step process. One, easier said than done, finding time in the schedule. Assigning kids to the win periods based upon universal screening. A best practice is to have kids use their own time to measure their win time. And then your win time can then also become your intervention cycles as well. And so in these slides, when you guys get them, I give you some example schedules of how to incorporate win time, what they look like at the elementary and also at the secondary level. So you guys can take a look at those. And then the last issue, I know because we're getting close to time, is how are we going to pay for all this? So I know some of you are probably sitting here like, we need to do a whole new campaign. We're gonna have to find 10 more donors to implement MTSS. But if you're looking for funding that is available, IDEA, which many of you know is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Part A funds students in public schools who have an IEP. Part B funds students who have an IEP in non-public and private schools, but it also can help fund your early warning system, which is MTSS. So one of the things to do is, whoever is your liaison for your IDEA Part B funds, is how you can tap into some of that money for your universal screening, your non-academic screening, and then a data system that can hold your whole early warning system together. And so together, I'm glad that we're able to be together to see every student succeed. And Catholic schools do empower kids to succeed and have a long track record of doing that, particularly in this post-pandemic era. So I appreciate you sticking with me as we went through the 4 ways that MTSS fulfills the mission of Catholic schools. And I'll end on this quote: all persons have the capacity to proclaim the gospel and to be living witnesses to its truth in the community of faith and offer valuable gifts. Their involvement enriches every aspect of church life. They are not just recipients of catechesis, they are also its agents. And so when we attend to those tier 2 kids and tier 3 kids, we're not only attending to them academically, but also non-academically and also their souls. Thank you so much. It was great being with you. I'll stick around and answer questions. And if you need to contact me, please do so via the QR code right there. What are the recommended minutes for ELA and math? Well, when you look at the research, and so for math, I'll refer you to the Dana Center at the University of Texas. Generally speaking, the research now with our kids who are so distracted by devices, who have shorter attention spans by about 4 or 5 minutes, generally speaking, 60 minutes of math divided into 15-minute activities is what's endorsed by a lot of the research. When it comes to ELA, the key is to separate reading from writing. So you can have mixed blocks, but you have an opportunity to incorporate science and social studies as nonfiction reading, but also for the research task and the narrative task, right? So if you think of science and social studies as ELA subjects where you're going to do the nonfiction tasks, you can find some time in your ELA blocks. But oftentimes when I'm dealing with elementary principals, they're like, I have no room because I have 180 minutes of ELA. I'm like, well, when are you doing science and social studies? Oh, that's another period that we have Monday, Wednesday, Friday, right? So there's some opportunities there to look at explicitly what skills and content are we addressing in those areas. Any other questions? All right, well, feel free to reach out to me. I really, really appreciate this, and I very much enjoyed this. God bless, and thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we have one more poll that we were going to run. So if we can run that poll, Jessica, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, I'm attempting to set up that poll, and there's a little bit of technical difficulties with that right now. If I'm not able to run it right now, I will certainly send that as a link in the follow-up email.
That works.
So
That works. Thank you.
you're welcome. All right, so thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. NCEA continuously strives to improve the quality of our services for our members based on feedback. We will use your input to inform future work and improve services. The survey that I dropped in the chat a few minutes ago takes about 5 minutes to complete. If you are interested in a certificate of attendance, please include your email address and name at the end of the survey. Since your certificate will be sent via automated email, please check your spam if you do not see an email within a few minutes. And again, since we were having technical difficulties, you will receive a poll question along with the follow-up emails that you will get tomorrow. Thank you very much for attending and have a wonderful rest of your day.